It's time to fire up your pineal gland and warm up some elk meat because today it's entirely possible that we're going to be talking about Joe Rogan.
It's entirely possible that
Well, not only is it entirely possible, it's guaranteed to happen because this video is about his podcast.
we just come to make sure your baby's okay. Crazy 800-pound silverback bursting through the trees.
The scale of Joe's podcast is impressive, as is its long list of high-profile celebrity guests. But instead of delving into deep discussion regarding its achievements and its significance in today's culture, I'd like to discuss a poorly understood piece of lore in regards to the podcast. That topic, or question really, is how exactly did the Joe Rogan Experience podcast start in the first place? The origin story of the podcast is not a topic that is routinely discussed on the podcast itself. And with many people, including myself, becoming fans of the show long after its debut, the origin story has become somewhat of an elusive tale that one only becomes aware of with a bit of dedicated research. So how did Joe Rogan go from being the Fear Factor guy to being the king of podcasts? Well, today I'm going to break it all down for you. This is the origin story of the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. So to get to the roots of the podcast, you have to go all the way back to the early 2000s. Around this time, Joe was juggling stand-up comedy, UFC commentary, and a network television gig. This was a time of growth in his career, and in 2001, he found himself becoming more relevant in pop culture after landing the host role for Fear Factor. If you're unfamiliar with Fear Factor, it was a game show on NBC that Joe hosted, and the point of the show was to make the contestants go through dangerous stunts, eat insects, do all kinds of foul shit for cash prizes. For many entertainers in the early 2000s, a network television gig was the end-all be-all best job to have. But for Joe, this wasn't necessarily the case, as being under the thumb of NBC and constrained to their neck-break speed of Fear Factor episode production quickly proved to be a soul-crushing and creatively draining endeavor. But for the time, he would bite the bullet, take the bag, and try to have some fun with it.
When I was on like season 5 of Fear Factor, I remember thinking, I don't know how much longer I can do this.
What was it about it that it was just too much, repetitive?
It was the same thing over and over again. We did 148 episodes.
Right.
It was just, after a while, it's just like, Jesus Christ, how many animal dicks can you serve people?
Right.
How many times can you throw them off buildings?
Yeah, it's enough already.
By 2003, Joe found himself in an interesting transition period in his career. A period which saw him becoming disillusioned with traditional television work, and him tinkering with experimental methods of content creation and distribution. In particular, he grew interested in the concept of creating web shows and other internet-based content centered around his comedy. As a matter of fact, Joe had maintained a website, joerogan.net, since at least the year 2000, and on there he often interacted with his fans using his website's forums. Joe saw the power of the internet early on and really wanted to double down on his internet presence. And doubling down meant creating video content for his website. The only problem was Joe needed a guy to record and edit the videos. And that being said, this is where we introduce one of the most important figures in all of the Joe Rogan Experience mythos, Brian Redvan. In 2003, Redvan was in his late 20s living in Ohio working a dead-end job at Gateway Computers. He also worked part-time as a freelance video editor. Of note, he had previously done video editing work for comedian Doug Stanhope.
I was really good at filming and editing, which I taught myself how to edit on Premiere or whatever it was. And then I was really good at compressing the video to be really, really small so you could put it on your website. Because they didn't have like streaming sites like YouTube and stuff yet. So I would do it for Doug Stanhope.
Stanhope was a rising comedian at the time and had a working relationship with Joe Rogan, as the two were actively working together as co-hosts on Comedy Central's The Man Show. So I think you can begin to see where I'm going here. Joe Rogan being friends with Doug Stanhope and also being aware of that this Brian Redvan guy did some video editing work for him, Joe decided to reach out to Redvan online and ask if he would work for him part-time, and this was an offer that Redvan happily accepted.
You're from Ohio.
Right. Yes, Columbus.
How long have you been in LA?
I moved out when I was 29, and I'm 41 now, so yeah, about 11 to 12 years.
And you moved out why?
I met Joe Rogan on the internet, and he started having me come to his shows, And then one day he's just like called me up and was like, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" I'm like, I work at Gateway Computers. And he's like, "Want to move to California and just film me and make small videos for me and do it?" I'm like, "Is this a real question?"
Yeah.
Yeah. So
This resulted in Redvan traveling to Joe's comedy shows and recording, well, pretty much everything. But the most notable things recorded were Joe's pre-show green room hangout sessions with other comedians. Joey Diaz, Ari Shaffir, and Eddie Bravo were often featured in these recordings. Names I'm sure you're all very familiar with by now. These green room hangout sessions would eventually be turned into a web show dubbed The Joe Show, and it became a series that essentially served as a proto version of the podcast itself. The first episode was released on JoeRogan.net in November of 2004, and it was popular with fans.
I hate this shit. I don't believe in this shit. I've told you 1,000 times. What the fuck? Why you gotta fucking text me? Brian Reichel, cocksucker. I don't accept the new technology. It's unacceptable. Listen, cocksucker, I'm from the fucking old school.
The two continued working together on Joe Show installments and other various short videos for the Joe Rogan website. Now, the Joe Show was active from 2004 to 2009, but within that 5-year time span, there were only 11 episodes ever produced. Fans who posted to the forums of Joe's website had long been asking him to produce video content at a faster rate, something that wasn't necessarily possible due to much of its production being anchored to Joe's touring schedule. So with fan feedback in mind, clearly they wanted content more often. This is where Redvan and Joe came up with the idea to do a weekly podcast from the comfort of Joe's office in Los Angeles. The plan for the podcast was to have Redvan as a permanent co-host, with Joe and Redvan discussing random topics and answering questions from fans submitted to Twitter and the Joe Rogan forums. The live streaming platform Ustream would be utilized to broadcast the show. The first episode of the then untitled Joe Rogan podcast would go live on Christmas Day of 2009. It's actually pretty surreal going back and watching this episode, as it really puts into perspective how amateurish this whole thing started off as. While it was somewhat of a rocky start on the technical side of things, Joe and Redvan would soon become more comfortable with podcasting, and the show would be a hit with fans. Within weeks, the podcast was regularly bringing in 500 plus live viewers per stream. As the show grew more popular, the format would be changed a bit, with the Q&A sections being removed, and more emphasis on Joe Rogan and his motley crew of comedian friends.
But this is ideally the best way to do a show. You know, this is way more fun than doing some show that's on television that nobody gives a shit about. You know, I mean, we can do whatever the fuck we want. You don't have to look at it. I don't want anything from you. You know, no one's getting paid.
Yeah,
it's
right.
Just for fun. You know, and you have interesting people over and you talk.
Hilariously, the podcast would acquire Fleshlight as its first sponsor in 2009. Which in a way proved to Joe that this was more than just a fun side hobby. It was also profitable.
Needs a little work. If
What, an
it's a
8-year-old's
girl,
ass? Look how little
It's
that
been
is.
bleached.
it's a girl with a butthole that's got a problem because that sucker's not airtight. Look at that. There's a little hole in there. See
It's gaping.
that? See that? Redvan? That's not good.
Yeah, after you ruined it last night.
Now keep in mind, for over a year of podcasting, Joe and Redvan had never actually given an official name to the podcast itself. It was offhandedly referred to as the Joe Rogan Podcast or the Weekly Ustream. And, well, they felt that, with the podcast becoming popular and relevant and brands coming in, that it was probably about time to give it an official name. So finally, in August of 2010, they gave it the name The Joe Rogan Experience. And thus, the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, as we all know it, was born. And with that, I think I fulfilled my purpose with this video. There were some other topics in regards to the podcast that I wanted to discuss, like there's a lot of people who wonder why, There's a lot of people who wonder why Brian Redvan was replaced by Jamie Vernon in 2013. And I want to talk about it, but maybe in the future. I don't want to muddy up this video too much, okay? We're going to keep it simple and cut it off at the origin story. But anyways, guys, let me know what you thought about this video down below, and let me know who or what you want me to talk about next. I want to give a major shout out to my patrons. I appreciate you guys. Wavy Web Surf out. Peace.